So welcome to Islands of Richness. My name's Todd Gardner. I've written a handful of JavaScript applications in the past. Islands of Richness is a nickname towards an application architecture. This set of code demonstrations is going to show off a bunch of the stuff that we learned along the way in developing that architecture. So today I showed you this boring slide, and this should be the last one I show you. Now we're going to jump in and play with some JavaScript libraries, and then we're going to write a little sample app. That's about all I got. So why don't we just jump straight into code? Wrong way. So the first thing I want to show you is Backbone. How many of you have heard of Backbone? Everybody, awesome, because I'm just going to blast through this real fast, and then we're going to code some stuff of it. So Backbone is a library that's going to help us structure our web application to make it more maintainable and testable going forward. The main things that we're going to use off of Backbone are a model, which is responsible for containing our data from the server and interacting with our server, and then views, which are responsible for interacting with the DOM, responding to user events, and that sort of thing. The other library that I want to show you, or before we do that, let me show you the sample app that comes with Backbone, which is to-dos. Has anybody seen to-dos before? Not as many people. So I have a to-do to find a TCC after party. So we can add that, adds it to the list. Double click on it, find a better TCC after party. When I find it, I can mark it off. I can refresh. Oh, I don't have connection. That's okay. I didn't connect. It stores it in local memory, so if I had been connected, I could have caught that. The other library I want to talk briefly about is _JS, which is a dependency of Backbone, written by the same people who wrote Backbone. Underscore is a utility belt in JavaScript that provides a lot of really useful functions. I like to compare it, for the .NET people in the room, is it's kind of like LINQ for JavaScript. It lets us enumerate over collections and arrays, find the items that we're looking for. It also provides a templating engine, which we're going to use here in this sample, so I wanted to show it off. The templating engine lets us build strings with partially dynamic content. So this is how we're going to choose, and we're going to render stuff into the DOM. So that's enough experimentation. Let's write some code. Everybody see the contrast okay? Is that good? All the way in the back? Excellent. All right, so I just have this really short structure here just to get us started. I'm bringing in jQuery underscore and Backbone, and just have a little bit of a DOM to hook into. So the first thing I'd like to do is let's write the obligatory hello world application. We're going to print hello world onto the screen. So to do that, I want to create a new JavaScript file that I'm going to call hello world view.js. This is going to be a type, so I'm going to start with capital letters. And we are going to extend backbone.view to do some of the things that we want it to do. Backbone views have two functions that it expects us to override. The first is initialize. Initialize is called when we're constructing objects. So this is where we can put any custom setup stuff we have. For the purpose of this one, I want to just declare that, set up a new model when we're initializing our view, because we're not actually going to talk to the server right now. So we're just going to declare a new Backbone model with a message in that model. And that message is going to be, hello world. And then when we're done initializing, we're going to say render, which leads us to the second function that Backbone expects us to implement. Render is the function that we're actually going to place stuff into the DOM. So we need to place the contents hello world into the DOM. But now we're going to need a template of how to wrap this thing up. So we're going to declare a template on our view, and we're going to use the underscore templating engine. We're just going to write in an h1 tag, and inside of that h1 tag, we are going to use the underscore templating syntax to write message into it. When we pass an object into this template, it's going to pull message out of our model and display it in this template. So now in our render, we have an object on our view called L, which is the element. All Backbone views have an element. We can either give it to it, a real element that's in the DOM, or if it doesn't get one of those, it's just going to create a DOM or a div that's not attached to anything. So we're going to wrap that up in jQuery, and we are just going to pass into the HTML of the element this.template, and to the template we're going to pass this.model.toJSON. ToJSON is an extension off of Backbone models that allows us, or that will transform the object from this complex Backbone type into just a simple JSON structure. And I saved it, so I got a bunch of stuff wrong. All right, so then back on our index, we should bring in our, actually don't want to do that, source. Let's bring in hello world view.js. When the document's ready, let's instantiate our view from hello world view. And to that view, let's pass it an element. And that element's just going to be this main div I have hanging out here below. So document will start up, we'll create a new view, we'll give it an element. As part of instantiating that view, we're going to call render. That should be enough that if we go over here to our app, this.configure is not a function. Probably screwed something up. Where did I screw up? To what? I've done live demos before, and so my immediate response to, oh God, I screwed something up, is, hey, let's just take from the one I already did. So I must have fixed it in what I did before. I don't really see. I missed the new keyword. Thank you. And we see hello world. Awesome. Hopefully that'll be my only screw up of the day. All right, let's do a more complex example. Let's build another Backbone view, but this time, let's actually talk to the server. So I've built an API already for this that's hanging out at shared API posts. And this is just going to return some JSON data that is an array of JSON objects that represent blog posts. So they have a title, an author, and some content. So let's write a little Backbone component that's going to consume this data and present it on the screen. So the first thing we're going to need is a post list view. So we're going to have a view that contains a list of posts. So that post list view, we're going to need a template on that. And that template will just be, h1 posts, and then a URL with an ID of posts. Inside the URL, let's just say loading for now, because we haven't fetched anything yet. Okay, so then when we initialize this view, we're going to need to go and get that list of posts from the server. So to do that, we're going to need to bring in a new Backbone type. And being that we're working with a list of objects, I think we should create a post collection. So we'll do it the same way. We'll extend backbone.collection this time. And a collection, all we really need to do in this case is provide a URL property. Tell it where on the server should it go to get its data. So it's going to go to shared API posts. And then in our post list view, we should instantiate the collection as a new post collection. And then tell the collection to go fetch itself. But that fetch is going to be an asynchronous request, and we need to like take some sort of action when this is done. So we're going to hook on to Backbone's eventing system and say, when the collection is reset, which is the event that's going to be fired when all of its data is changed out, we want to call this.render. We need to put this before the fetch event, because if for whatever reason that happens really, really fast, we would not have set up our event by the time that this data actually came back from the server. So now let's declare our render function. So when we come back and render, the collection will contain a list of posts. And now for each one of those, we need to show some data on the screen. So we're going to use some underscore and loop across each of the things in this.collection.models. And for each of those, we can provide a function on that post to do something. Now I think we're going to need another view. This view is going to represent a single post in that list that we can create again and again and again and just place into our list. So let's create that. So this is going to just be the post view, as opposed to the post list view, which we were already creating. Post view is going to need a template. And for this thing, I think we'll probably just do maybe an H3 that displays, let's see, what did we have again? We have title, author, and content. So we'll have title, we'll place right there. And then we'll do a, I don't know, p tag, and do the author. And then, I don't know, just for variety. Okay, I think I got that right. So then when we initialize this, I don't necessarily think we want to do anything, but we'll make a render function that will let the post list view tell a post when to render. So we'll call this from the outside. So when we render, we'll wrap up the element in a jQuery, say this.html will be this.template, and to the template we'll pass this.model.toJSON. So I'll show you how we're going to use this back here in post list view. So we're looping across each of our posts. For each of those, we're going to create a new view, which will be a new post view. And to that post view, we'll pass an object that says, your model is the post. And now, we're going to use the this.$, which is an extension in Backbone that's a scope selector. It's anything I select here is going to be within the scope of the current view, just to make sure we're not crawling the whole DOM. We are going to render into posts. We are going to append onto posts view.render.l, which is, this is a convention you'll see all over Backbone, is that view will call render, and then we're going to chain onto it and just place the element of that view directly inside of the HTML we're rendering. But to enable that, we'll have to return this inside of the render. Does everybody follow that? No? Yes? Okay. So I believe this is enough for this to work. Well, we need to put it up here. So we need to add a couple of scripts tags here. So we're going to need to bring in the post list view.js. We're going to need to bring in the post collection. And we're going to need to bring in the post view. And then we can probably just copy this for now, and we need to place this somewhere. So we'll create a new post list view. And for the sake of argument right now, let's just create a main 2. So we'll put this guy in. So now, if I have everything right, we'll see hello world, and then an AJAX request to go and get that list of code. And when that's done, we'll see the list of customers. Nothing ever goes right in a presentation. Or I'll just punt and take my accepted source. Now it's all right, because now I took it from working source. So we're good now. All right. So we see loading on the screen. We're going to replace that with posts, authors, all the way down. Cool. All right. So just a quick recap of what we did so far is I brought a bunch of code from stuff I've already written, because I can't write in front of an audience. And we built some stuff with Backbone. Backbone is about structuring our JavaScript code. We have lists, or we have views that interact with the DOM, and we have collections that interact with the server. Backbone we've used for enumerating over collections and creating templates. So Backbone is very much about utilities in JavaScript. Yeah, Backbone's assumption is that you have a RESTful JSON API. If you don't, Backbone is actually going to fight you tooth and nail. You can make it work. You can override a bunch of base classes in Backbone to have it work with an XML API or work with your own custom way of doing things, but it's not going to be fun. It's in PHP. The new syntax that came out in Backbone 09 is to use on. In Backbone 05, on wasn't a word that they were using. They were using the term bind to binding to view or binding to events, but they're kind of following the jQuery line of thinking of using on. Okay, let's move on to another library, Require.js. Require is, I like to think of it for the .NETers in the room, that this is an IOC container for JavaScript. This is for managing JavaScript modules and managing dependencies. So it will bring in JavaScript libraries using AJAX just in time when you need them. So let's jump in and do some code for that. So back in our index, we're bringing in jQuery underscore and Backbone. Let's bring in another one. Let's bring in Require. And I cannot remember what version of Require I used. 107. So Require has a very interesting concept. Is when Require loads, it's actually going to, just by the act of loading, it's going to inspect the DOM, and it's going to look for its script element that it was loaded with. And it's going to look for a data main attribute. And whatever is in data main, it's going to think that this is a file that it should use to bootstrap the application. Notice that I'm not putting the extension on here. Require has an assumption that any time you're asking it to load a file, it's a JS file. And it's just going to automatically append the extension. So by doing this, Require is going to load up, and it's going to execute the contents of a loader.js file. So why don't we take the contents that we're just putting in the DOM right now out of here and put it into a loader.js file. So now our page should be functionally equivalent, but the order that things happen in should be slightly different. So let's do a refresh. See, everything still works. But I want to show you what's happening in Firebug. So we see all of the dependencies that are placed directly on the page are all loading in parallel right at the beginning. But then just a hair later, we see loader is brought in. Loader is brought in by Require after it's been parsed and loaded. So what this is going to let us do is, rather than placing all of our different files directly in on the page to be loaded, we can choose when that they're loaded by defining these things as modules, and then bring them in with Require. As you can see already from some very simple things we've done with Backbone, Backbone does create a lot of files. So why don't we wrap Hello World up as a Backbone module that we can bring in when it's needed. So I'm going to do that by wrapping the function in this call to define. Define is part of Require. What define is doing is it's saying that this function that we're putting inside of it, we're defining this thing as a module. The first argument that it takes is an array. It's an array of strings. And this is going to be any of the dependencies that this module has. If this file depends on other files being loaded first, Require would trace that dependency and load them first. What the auxiliary benefit that this has is now this hello world view, rather than just smashing onto the global scope, is now wrapped up in this module. This can now only be accessed through Require. But in order for us to do that, we need to return the hello world view out of this function so that it's actually accessible. So now if we go back to loader, in loader, we're going to use another Require function, which is just require, that has the exact same syntax of define. The difference is require can be called at any point during code execution, not just at the beginning of the file. And it can be used to bring in files for a particular chunk of code. So in this case, what I want to do is I want to bring in hello world view, which will come in to this function as a hello world view based on the return that we used. And now this function, now hello world, will be available here. And we can remove it from the script tag. So if everything is working, we should be able to go and reload the page. Hello world's still there. And now we can see additional ordering that's happening when pulling in libraries. So all of the things that were just on the page itself are still being pulled in order. We see loader launch, and then we see hello world being brought in because Require is tracing that dependency. So I'm going to, in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and just bring in the rest of our modules so that everything is defined as a module. I want to call your attention to the post list view we created earlier. So when we define the post list module, it actually needs the post collection and the post view. Those are dependencies for it. So now the loader is going to bring in hello world and post list. And when post list stands up, post list needs to bring in post collection and post view. So if we watch how this is rendering now, we see loader start up, we see hello world start up, and post list view start up at the same time. And then after post list view has been parsed, it brings in post collection and post view immediately afterwards before it can start rendering. So the next thing I'd like to show is, so hanging out in this post list view that we created earlier, or I'm sorry, in the post view that we created earlier, we have this kind of gnarly bit of HTML shoved in a JavaScript string. I don't know if you've ever tried to maintain HTML in JavaScript. It gets kind of nasty pretty fast. So I'd like to pull this out, manage it in a separate file, and use Require to load it in when it's needed. So I'm going to cut this out of here and create a new file. It's going to be a post template file. And in the post view, we can now define what if we just call this post template.html and bring this in as a post template and shove that right into the template. What would be awesome to happen is that if this just pulled all the way down and works through. Does anybody know what's going to happen here? Other than Crystal and Kevin? Yep, that's exactly right. It's going to look for posttemplate.html.js because it thinks it's a JavaScript file. So we need to bring in a plugin for Require called text. What the text plugin does is it says, all right, this file I'm going to ask you to bring in, it's not JavaScript. It's just text. Read it in, drop it in as a string, do whatever you want with it. So to do that, we need to configure Require to tell it where these plugins are. So we're just going to configure paths, and we're going to say text is at shared lib text. So now that it knows where it is, we can tell Require to use the text plugin during this define call by just saying text bang before the file in question. So now if we give this thing a try, we can pull in the post template just like an HTML file using an XHR query. So just a quick recap of what we did with Require.js is Require is about managing JavaScript dependencies. We define our different pieces of JavaScript as modules, and we bring them in as they're needed. So with what we've learned so far, I think we should build an application that shows off some of the benefits of structuring our JavaScript using Backbone and loading in these modules. So I'm thinking, let's build a simple iGoogle type application that we have widgets on a screen that show different pieces of functionality. Those functionality are placed on multiple pages so that we can show that we have a series of whole screen applications that we're rendering without page reloads. Would that be cool? No? Yes. I hope so. That's the presentation I prepared. So that's what you're getting. So let's sync up to make sure I'm not too far off base. So the first thing I'd like to do is we probably have a couple of widgets on that we've built already. We've built a hello world widget and we've built a post widget. So let's convert these into widgets. So the way I like to organize widgets is I like to have a widgets folder. And to that widgets folder, we're going to put all of these different JavaScript files that we created as part of widgets. And we really have two widgets. We have the hello world widget that really just has the hello world view. And we have a post list widget that has a whole bunch of stuff. So now we need to change our loader a little bit. We need to tell it where our widgets are. So now we're going to have widgets slash hello world slash hello world view and widgets slash post list slash post list view. And I don't know, it doesn't like that syntax, but it works. So if we refresh this, again, everything should look exactly as it did, but we've just done a little bit of house cleaning. So now, first baby step, rather than just having this gnarly bit of functionality that just renders on document ready, let's create an application. And this application will be responsible for rendering one of these widgets on one page. Let's just take that baby step and move on. So first, let's define our application.js file. So this is going to be a module just like everything else. And the application is going to be a backbone view. So the application, let's see, what should the application need to do? So we need to figure out what our page needs to look like. Right now we have a fairly simplistic page that just has main and main2 on it. And main2 we should probably rip off here shortly. I'm imagining a page that has 4 different places for widgets, a quadrant. And that is like a template for the page. But I don't want to put it directly here in our HTML file because that would really lock us in. So I'd like to be able to change these out. So let's, instead of putting in the HTML, let's define a page template.html file. And so our page is going to have a couple of things on it. I'm thinking a page header, so we can say what's in the page. And then probably a row that contains two different locations. And then to make this a quadrant, let's do that again. So now we have a page template. So now on our application, we can define that as our first dependency and say that we need textbang/page template.html will come in as a page template. And then we can define our page template as an underscore template of page template. Let's see. When we render our page, the first thing we need to do is we need to place our page template but we don't really need to pass any model to it because we don't have anything too specific with it. And then onto that page template, we need to place our widget. So right now, happening in loader, we're just doing this. But when we convert this to an application, I really don't want a widget having a real element on the screen. That feels like the widget knows more about the DOM than it really should. I'd like to just ask the widget to render itself, and me as the application, I'm going to put it in the DOM. So that I can put it there, I can take it out, I can destroy it if I want to. I don't want to ask the widget's permission to rip itself out of the DOM. So rather than passing the element in, I'm just going to ask it, I'm just going to instantiate it. And I don't really need a copy of it. So we could just do this dot, the jQuery selector, the scoped one. And I think we have location1 is what I created. .html is going to be a new hello world view .render.l. Right. So does everybody follow that? I know that's a lot of chaining, but we're finding location1 within the application's element, and we're creating a new instance of the hello world view, rendering it, and grabbing its element, shoving it back into the location. So now the only remaining question is, how do we want this application to start? Well, normally there's an initialize function, which there is anyway, but I don't really want to just call render right away, because I might want to, create an instance of my application before I'm necessarily ready to start it. So I like just creating a start function and being really explicit about this. So with how we have things set up right now, start is this .render. We also brought in that hello world, so we should bring it in as a dependency, huh? So widgets, hello world view. And that'll come in as hello world view. Okay. So then back on our loader, we really don't need to bring in our widgets anymore. We just need to bring in the application, which will come in as the application. And then when the document's ready, we'll just say, in fact, we could probably leave this part as is and just change this to application is a new application. We'll give it the element that we want the application to run on, and then tell the application to start. And so that should be enough where the application will start up and will render hello world on the screen, right? Hello world. Awesome. All right, so let's extend this because we kind of rolled back in functionality. Now we're only showing one widget. So let's create a second page where we'll show a second widget. So to do that, we're going to need to introduce a new concept out of Backbone called the router. What the router does is the router will look at the hash fragment in the URL and allow us to respond to different events based on it. So it's like a whole nother browser experience in the browser without ever talking to the server again. So let's create a new file called router.js. And it's going to be an AMD module just like everything else. But this time we'll extend router. The router has an interesting collection or an object that it uses inside of itself called routes. And routes is a key value pair that allows us to define a particular expression that it's going to look for in the hash fragment and then the event that it will throw when that expression matches. So for example, the default route that you should always have is called splat default. Splat default will match everything. This is the equivalent of, hey, something may be here, it may not be here, and whatever it is, match the default query. And when that matches, we want to throw the default route, or the default event. But we probably want another route that I want to call page. So this time I use colon. Colon is specifying that there will be a parameter here called page. If you type in hash my page, this route will match with my page as the argument. And if this happens, I want to throw the page event. And this is really all there is to the router, is we're just setting up what we want it to do. And I'm going to go back to the application where we'll handle the events that will spawn off of this. So our application needs to take in a router now, which will come in as a router. And we can define at the top of our application as router is a new router. So now in our empty initialize function, we need to set up some events. So just like we bound to that collection event earlier on the blog, we're going to do this.router.on, and it's going to throw route events. We define two different events, a route default, that I'll define a function called on default route. And a second route called page on page route. Now the router, I missed something. The router is based off of another Backbone concept called the Backbone history. This is Backbone's wrapper around your browser's history API. And so we need to start Backbone history in order for these routes to start matching. Because until we do that, it's not actually looking at the hash fragment. Now we could just call backbone.history.start normally, but that makes it really hard to test because I can't just start up the router without Backbone history really starting and then navigating me over to my test page. So I like to wrap this up in a function called start. This is just my own little habit that people on my team would notice that, hey, I got starts in a lot of places. But we're just going to wrap up this call so that when we're testing the router, we could mock out the start function to be something that doesn't really do stuff. So then our start function on the application, rather than just calling render immediately, because shouldn't presume what page we're on, we should call this.router.start, which will kick off the router and we'll start doing stuff. So now we need to define our callback functions for what we want to do. So render, as we defined it before, is really just what we want to do with onDefaultRoute. When the onDefault route is hit, we want to render the page template and render hello world in location 1. And when onPageRoute is hit, we want to render the post list view into location 1. Yeah, they're different pages. They should have their own location 1s. So we need to make sure we have the post list view in here. Gotta change the.
Line 6. Hello world will be something else.
Oh, thank you. Okay. Did I miss anything else? Okay, so now we have our main page. But if I go up here and do a hash fragment and go to some other page, because we didn't really specify what page we were going to, we go to a post page. That's pretty cool. Let's add a little bit to this to actually show what page we're on. So this dot, what did we say? Page header dot HTML is going to be h1 default page. And then on a page route, so the, dang it. The page route is actually going to pass in the page that was asked for on the route as the function. So we could just plop that right in here. And if we go back here, we get page 1 and posts. If we take this off, you can see default page, hello world. And we could say, go to a TCC page, and we're basically just picking up whatever page you ask for right at the moment. So let's do one more thing just to make this easier on us going forward, is let's define some navigation on our app. Yeah, thank you. No, I meant to do that. Okay, so now we can navigate back and forth. And just one thing that I am still just amazed at, but maybe I'm just lame, is that I'm navigating between two pages. To the user, this would look like, hey, I'm navigating between two different websites, but we are never actually reloading the page. We're refiring our AJAX requests, but the whole page isn't being refetched. We're not re-asking for jQuery. We're not doing any of that stuff. So to enhance this experience a little bit and make this feel a little bit more real, why don't we bring in some CSS that I constructed earlier and some other widgets. So there's a whole lot more stuff in the page template right now, but it's really just about, I used Twitter Bootstrap and I needed to add some classes to it. I still have the same approach where I have a page header, navigation, a location 1, location 2, location 3, location 4. I just prettied them up a little bit. I also defined two other widgets for us earlier. One is a Twitter feed, bring down a list of tweets similar to what we were doing with posts, and a weather widget that will check yesterday, today, and tomorrow's weather. Fake, of course. So if we take a look at this, we have a little bit prettier app. Things are styled a little bit. So we have hello world and weather and tweets on the front page. And on page 1, we have our posts and our tweets. And of course, everything is styled now, so it actually looks real. So the next thing I'd like to do is I'd like to wrap up every time we place a widget on a page, we're just taking the whole contents of that widget and we're just shoving it in there. There's no common styling, there's no common padding. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to take a common container, this widget container, and I'd like to place this into the DOM every time we're pushing a widget there. And I'd like to use the title of that widget as its header, and then put the actual content of the widget inside of this div so that we can put some appropriate padding around it. So this widget container, I'd like to transform it into an underscore template, and we'll just call this the name. This we'll put into this h3 tag. And then on the application, we should bring in our other template. No, there isn't a way to just to pull in all the things from a directory, but there is an extension to Require that unfortunately I don't have time to go into today. Or it's not really an extension, it's just another part of it called Require.js, which is a bundler. What it'll do is at development time, it will trace the dependencies of your modules and bundle them all into a single JavaScript file for you so that it doesn't actually result in multiple requests during runtime. Yes, it'll shove the HTML and the CSS straight into the same file. So you could wrap the templates, the JavaScript, and the CSS for a widget into one file, call it the hello world widget.js, and it'll come down. Our designers follow this just fine because nope, they don't really get into the JavaScript, but that's where all of these templates come from. As our designers work in these templates, they define these snippets of HTML, and we figure out how to place them into the DOM into the right place.
One more question.
Sure.
Is it possible then to, like you were using Require.js for your templates? Obviously during development, it's handy to like change the template file, rather than having to reload the whole app and wrap it. Can you just force it to go re-request the newer version of that template?
Can you force it to go get the newer version? I don't know. Can you force it to get the newer version? I don't know. We can figure it out afterwards if you like. Okay, so I brought in that container template, and I brought it in as just widget template. And so we need to change our logic around how we're placing these widgets in the DOM. Let's start with just this hello world one as an example. So right now we are just taking the guts of hello world and placing it straight into the location. And I'd like to do something different now. We need to take the widget container template and place that into the HTML. And then within location one's header component or header container, we need to look for widget content. So at this point, it might be easier to cache our selector and say var location is this dot location one, and then locations HTML will be that. And now we need to look within location. So we can use the jQuery selector for, let's see, what is it? Widget container, widget content, widget content. Widget content inside of the location, and there we'll append the HTML of the new hello world container. We also would need to do a similar search and say, let's see, what did we call the header? Oh, no, I needed to pass an object in here. So this widget container template will take an object where we need to define a name, and the name of this is just going to be hello world. That's not a good line. Okay, so let's see if I got that right. So we go back to page 1, refresh this. I have errors. This widget container template is not a function. I just called it widget template, that's why. Okay, so now we have a header called hello world around our widget, and we have some appropriate padding. So I really don't want to replicate what was one line of code and is now 6 lines of code all over. So let's see if we can abstract this out a bit. I think we can create a render widget function. And to that function, let's see, what do we use here? We use a string that is a jQuery selector, another string which is a name, and we instantiate a type. So I think we could take a type a name and a location in onRenderWidget. And location will just be a jQuery selector. Name will pass into that. And rather than creating new hello world view, we'll create new widget. That should then change this code to be this.renderWidget, to be a hello world view, hello world, and location 1. And we can rip all of that off. All right, let's double check that still all works. That's good. So now we can just change all of our other calls on that render widgets to use this new syntax, which I think for the sake of time, I'm just going to bring out of source, because I think that was the last thing I wanted to do as part of this exercise. Okay, so now we are calling render widget for hello world, weather, and Twitter feed on the front page, and post list and Twitter feed on the second page. And our render widget, I think, does all the things it did before. Right? I didn't lose anybody with that? Tell me if I did. Now if we reload this, we can see that all of our widgets are now appropriately sized and spaced inside of containers. And they all have their own header bars. So this thing is starting to look kind of real. Okay. So this application, it's still pretty brittle. We still have defined that we have a normal page that if you don't ask for anything, we're going to render the same 3 widgets every time. And if you ask for any other page in the world, we're going to render 2 other pages. That seems kind of hacky, right? Why don't we change this so that we render out of configuration, so that we can configure what widgets might show on a page, and that we restrict that what they're asking for is a real thing. So for the sake of, looks like I already did it. I was going to write this out, but for the sake of development time, let's just put this in the DOM. We could ask for this from the server, but let's assume for the moment that this HTML is coming down from some sort of dynamic source, that we can populate this configuration based on what page they asked for. So we have, in our app, we've defined this concept called a page. We've defined 2 different pages so far. We've defined the home page, which is the default page, and we've defined page 1, which is not the default page. Within a page, we also defined widgets. And widget today really just consists of a name and a selector as to where we put it. So if we save this and take a look right now, we should be able to access our configuration, which should just be hanging out on a window right now. You can take a look at this and see what's in it. But that isn't very cool to just drop this on window and let anything that has access to window look at it. So I want to wrap this thing up in another object. Let's define a config.js object, which will manage our configuration for us. So this is going to be a module, just like everything else. It's just going to be a backbone.model.extend. But when this model, so I'm going to use this model a little bit not how Backbone was intended. Because on initialize, rather than going off and telling it like, here's your URL, go and fetch this thing, I'm just going to say, when you initialize, I want you to set yourself up based on window.config. And then I want you to delete window.config so that any other, say if I, hired some other developers to go and write widgets for me, and they got clever and just decided to figure out where they are in the page by examining config, I really wouldn't want that to happen. So when the config starts up, we'll set ourselves up, and then we'll remove it from the page to prevent other people from accessing it. And now our application, we need to bring in the new config file. So now we should have a configuration. So let's look at this page route. So it's kind of gross that we just take any old page that you ask for and just render it. Let's check that if the page you asked for really exists. So we can use underscore for this. So let's grab a selected page is underscore.find in this.config.get pages. Will be a function on the page. So what this is doing is we are going to loop across the array that's hanging out in the config as pages, and for each element in that array, we're going to execute this function with that element giving the name the page. So in this case, we are going to say the page.name, because the page is going to be that object from configuration, .to lowercase, because you never know what the user typed in, is equal to page.to lowercase. Oh, and we need to return that comparison. Yeah, that makes more sense. So what this is going to go through is just going to loop through until it finds one of these values that returns true. And as soon as it returns true, that true value will be, or the element that matched that truthy value will be returned as the selected page. So now we can check if there was a selected page, because there might not have been. Now we can do real stuff. Otherwise, we should just do something like this. You typed in something that wasn't good. So do real stuff. So I'm almost thinking we should abstract this out of this function into a this.renderPage, where we pass the selected page there. And then we can probably just close out this function and call the rest of this renderPage, which is a function that takes in a page. So let's see if what we have so far works. Not found. Should it not be found? Home and page 1. Initialize. Yep. Good catch. I don't know who saw that. Thank you. Okay. Object. That's awesome. All right. So now, before page was just a string coming in off the router. Now it's an object. So we need to say page.name. Okay. Hey, there we go. So now if we type in tccc, now we get not found because that's not in our configuration. So let's go back to render page, because right now we're not really honoring what widgets were configured to be on that page. We're just always rendering these two. So we should probably change that. So we probably can go ahead and keep rendering page template. And now we can render the page name into the page head. But rather than rendering these widgets, we really need to loop across page.widgets and figure out what widgets it wants to render. So for each of those widgets, our first task is going to be, we need to load that widget, because we shouldn't just expect that the application has already loaded the widget. So we can go back to require, and we need to build a require path that looks something like this. Widget slash the widget name slash the widget name view has been the convention to date. So we can build that sort of string using underscore, using the underscore template engine. So we can define this as widget path is a template. And I'll just rip this off. But rather than placing name in there, we'll use the underscore syntax. And now we can widget path and pass in the widget, because the widget will have a name property, and that will get filled in. And after Require has finished loading it, it will drop an instance of that widget into this function right here. And so now at this point, I have the widget's name, the widget's location hanging off of the lowercase widget, and I have the widget type hanging here on the uppercase widget. So what would be really tempting to do is just say this.render widget, pass in widget, widget.name, and widget.location. But does anybody see why that isn't going to work? Nope, it hasn't instantiated it yet. Well, the problem is going to be a scoping issue. So render widget's hanging out on here, on the view. But I'm not in the view at this point. I'm hanging out, I have a callback function here in underscore, which has a second callback function here in require. So I don't really know what this is anymore. This could be anything. In fact, this is probably window at this point, because require won't know what it will be. So we need to just do a little trick and define that. And we will call that render widget. So now we can get rid of these two explicit calls to render widget. Did everybody follow that? This, that nonsense? Okay. So now we're rendering our page. We place the page name in, and we can render the widgets. So why don't we go and take a look back on page 1, and we see that we're loading things exactly as we were, except that it's not nearly as explicit. If we look at the order that things are coming in now, we see that tweet collection and weather are coming in quite a bit after the original page load, which is reflecting that we're not loading them in until we know that we're going to need them on this page. So we have one more thing we need to fix, is that's on default route isn't really doing anything just yet. It's still has the explicit calls to render these widgets. We really need to find a way to hook this thing up to render page, where we've already written all this code. So I'm going to copy on page route as a starting place. But on the default route, we don't necessarily have a page by name to search for. So rather than asking for comparing anything to the page's name, we can return page.isDefault. Remember we set up that property on the DOM here? So we look for a single thing to have that isDefault property. We should probably rename this to default page. If there's a default page, we want to call render page with that default page. And if there's not, well, it's not that it's not found, it's a bad config, really, because we never defined which page was default. So now if we go back to our default page, we can see that everything is rendering. Oh, let's do one more thing just to prove everything out. All of these explicit calls to bring in these widgets, they're all gone. The application no longer should have any knowledge about what widgets exist. So we reload this. Everything comes in. We watch the network. We see that we've brought in Hello World, Weather, and Twitter, but we have not brought in posts. So if we go to page 1, it brings in posts when it's needed. So I want to just recap what we built here. So we built this JavaScript application file here that reads configuration out of a model, which could be, in our case, it's just reading it out of the DOM, but it could be off of a JSON endpoint for configuration. It reads in that configuration, and we render arbitrary bits of JavaScript based on the convention of where we want to put widgets. The application itself has no knowledge about the widgets itself when it is starting up. The application is capable of rendering multiple screens of content with different templates and different widgets, different functionality on each page. And each widget is completely isolated from the others. It has no knowledge of the other widgets. It can be tested in isolation from themselves.